So you played some late night cold weather tennis yesterday, didn't you?
Yes. And I know you're a tennis player too. So,
Yes. I've done my cold weather tennis as well.
yeah.
My friend, she has does what's called the Polar Bear Club, and they play outdoors all winter.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
commitment.
For New Jersey, it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Thorpe.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Miller.
I'm delighted that you're here to talk about family estrangement, a difficult topic, but in your outstanding presentation to the New Jersey Psychological Association last month, you mentioned some statistics that were pretty alarming. And I didn't realize that several studies have found that 1/4 of the American population has estrangement, or meaning a cutoff. And I was wondering if you could talk to that and globally about prevalence.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, when I first heard it, I just couldn't believe it. So, family estrangement in general. Carl Pillemer is at Cornell University. He's a sociologist, and he also specializes in gerontology, so geriatrics. And he did a very large scale national study on family estrangement. And he found that about a quarter of Americans are struggling with no contact with a family member. And most are very bothered by it. They're very upset by it. So they don't take it
Yes.
lightly. And, one of the most common forms is between a parent and a child. That's about 10% of Americans. Even that is really high.
And your presentation was about parents and adult children for the most part, right?
That's correct. I just, had to sort of zone in on that. And it's been in the news so much lately, it really piqued my interest because I come from a background as a psychologist working in the divorce space a lot with families as they separate and divorce. And that is the one of the most common triggers. We see that a child will align and become estranged from one parent during divorces.
Can you introduce yourself so that folks know about your background, especially all of your studies on couples?
Well, I've studied a lot in the John and Julie Gottman methodology, GOTTMAN, as well as emotionally focused couples therapy, EFT. And I like to bring sort of science based evidence based practices to my couples as well as my families. And a lot of the skill set, applies to both groups. And people really
Yeah.
struggle with relationships, and they're often in my office for that. And most of us, we're very busy. I mean, the need is huge out there.
Yeah. Certainly. Yeah.
Hmm.
Now, I guess it would help if you could define estrangement, what that means, because it's not as black and white as I thought.
Right. It's nuanced, isn't it? And
Hmm.
you know, basically, it's a cutoff to some degree. Um, doesn't have to be complete no contact. There could be some connection through a family text thread or Facebook, Instagram. There's so many ways to connect now. And geography is an issue because people live far now. So,
That's
but there are
right.
these, ways to keep in touch, and people may or may not avail themselves. But certainly, we look at not only whether they're having contact, but we also look at how close do they report feeling to the person, or distant.
Yes.
Um, and sort of, what are the expectations of the relationship? Is it sort of, a holiday kind of relationship where they see each other on holidays, or do they really see each other quite a bit on the weekends or vacation together, and what are the expectations? How do they show care if family member is sick?
Or they have accomplishments as well. right?
Yes,
Celebrations. How do they
celebrations.
show care? Yeah.
Yes, I love that. Right. How do they celebrate things?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There are some situations where you do think it's okay to allow the estrangement to happen, I guess you would say. What are those situations?
Well, absolutely. And I think every person, every patient needs to decide what fits for them. Where is their line between continuing the estrangement or the cutoff and, attempting a reconciliation. And if there's severe untreated mental illness, substance abuse, continued negative toxic behaviors, boundaries are not respected, all of those kinds of things, then somebody really needs to make that decision that, enough is enough. Um,
Yeah.
but if somebody is accountable for their behaviors and they can take in the feedback and they're willing to make some changes, I think that's a great sign that, it's a green light for reconciliation. And I think, therapist led, facilitated, or even it could be a religious figure or a family respected family member that could help out with the estrangement.
So before we go to solutions
Right.
and advice for therapists, advice for
Sure.
parents, advice for the adult children,
Mhm.
maybe can you share what are some common triggers to family estrangements?
Well, there's so many reasons, that estrangements can happen. And it could be parenting factors. The obvious ones are abuse, neglect, poor parenting, and poor communication. And it could be the parenting style, they're cold and rigid, or the helicopter parenting that we hear about.
Hmm.
And that book, Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, in 2024, they talk about that. So for any parents, I would recommend that book for sure. To adjust your parenting style to give the child the ability to be more independent and autonomous over time. Other reasons are financial issues. A lot of different kinds of things there. And we see with young adults prolonged emerging adulthood, making children rely on parents longer. Um, when the natural drive is for autonomy. So, because of education, they're in school forever, graduate school, or they can't afford, because the cost of living and housing is so expensive now. So, it sort of forces this close relationship when that's not necessarily so natural. And divorce, that's by far one of the main triggers for no contact. And not only divorce, but repartnering and continued co parenting conflicts. The child or adult child may feel, a loyalty bind. Who do they go to? The parents may be pressuring them. They may just feel like this. They're in the middle. Um, And I think now with social media, there's so much miscommunication via texts and emails, and there's limited time and skill for clarification and repair.
Mm.
And there's also these big societal shifts where, it used to be in the old days, respect your elders, family forever. And people don't buy into that as much anymore. There's much more greater emphasis on individuality, protecting your mental health, and greater acceptance of ending relationships. And all the and ideological conflict, right? Political differences. And if we go back to COVID, risk tolerance, all of these things are big wedges in families.
You mentioned that this is not new, though, historically, family estrangements.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it was reported back in the 60s, cutoffs, where people have written about it since. What we have noticed in terms of trends is parents used to be the ones disapproving of, a spouse or occupational choice. Now it seems to be more the children that are doing the cutoffs with parents. So I think we have noticed that. Oh, and I was going to say too, we see it cross culturally. They're doing a lot of research in other countries like England, Australia, Germany, um, some of the Scandinavian countries. So I'm seeing a lot of books and research out of there as well. It's much harder for fathers. 1 in 4 respondents of this one study reported at least a period of estrangement from their father. And that study was in 2023 by Rezek and uh, Thomarin. It was in the Journal of Marriage and Family.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful study. So fathers really struggle more once the child reaches 15 onward. And fathers and daughters are really at risk. And a lot of that is divorce. The good news is some of these estrangements are temporary and resolve within 2 to 3 years at a pretty
Oh,
high
that's
rate.
good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is good. And, parental characteristics play a role in this. And, if the parents remain living together, there's a much lower hazard of estrangement.
What are the consequences of estrangement?
Well, it depends. For a parent and an adult child or children, the stigma is very heavy. And it could be that they've heard the judgment from others, or it could be that they perceive that others are judging them. But it's a really heavy stain to carry around and not to personalize. And people struggle with a lot of pain over all of this and the feeling of being powerless. They can't affect change. They can't,
For those that are the ones that are estranged, you're saying
yeah,
feel
they they
powerless.
they often do. They cannot impact the other person, to
Hmm.
repair their relationship in
I
any way
definitely
sometimes.
noticed that with some patients
Hmm.
who are struggling with that pain. And um, actually, it's adult sisters,
Hmm.
cutoffs between adult sisters in
Hmm.
two different situations. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I have lots of examples, of
I'm sure
the
you do.
different kinds of dyads. I have a brother and sister
Hmm.
coming in next week, and they're all grown,
Yeah,
but, I've definitely worked with, and sometimes we see it in families too. Cutoffs are sort of the way you handle conflict, or disagreements or pain. It's too painful. That's the way we handle love. We cut them off, and
hmm
we do see this sort of a tendency in families.
I've definitely seen intergenerational patterns of cutting people off.
Yes,
Yeah. And
absolutely. And
they learn, right?
they
Generation
learn
after
that.
generation. Like, um, I think it's very difficult in some situations, in these situations, to move toward a conversation. I think it's scary and
Yeah,
painful, especially when one party feels the other one's been rude, has said mean things. I think
yeah.
it can be very hard to move toward those conversations.
Right. And I think each person has to do quite a bit of work first, on themselves. And, we were talking about sort of consequences because parents can come into this feeling a total loss of their parenting role. So their kind of ability to give advice is kind of taken away. The child or adult child doesn't appreciate that anymore. So it could really leave the parent feeling rejected, shame, and it's very hard to feel that pain and then show vulnerability and not come to the table with anger. Um, And for children, some studies show, they lose emotional support, financial support, the social benefits that a family can provide. And a lot of these, kids, they have rumination. Did they make the right decision in this
Hmm.
cutoff? And then, there's a subset of kids that Agales in 2017 and 18, she's found that it's personal growth, it's healing and happiness. And it just depends on what the circumstances are and what the behaviors have been. And this is
Yeah.
very common in sort of the AA Al-Anon world, right? They deal with these kinds of boundary issues all the time.
Can you say more about that, about boundary issues?
Well, um, yeah, setting, if it's parents giving money to a child that, is using, for example, I mean, that's kind of
Ah.
an obvious one. Or I have it the opposite way, where the child, teenager or adult child, they have to set a limit. They're not going to go to the restaurant or the holiday party because the parent is actively drinking, and they
Mm.
don't want that around their children or whatever it might be. But there's a lot of kinds of things like this. Just wondering if there's any other consequences if we talked about it. Oh, I was going to say, historically, been a real taboo topic, and there is so much pain associated with it, as you said, and shame, that it hasn't been discussed much, but it's getting discussed a lot more. As I said, it's in the news a lot. There's been a flurry of research in the US and cross culturally over the last 5 years, 10 years. And if we look to celebrities, they're really in the news about this and talking about it more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because historically, our very own Dr. Sharp at Rutgers in New Jersey here, she's found that her research, often if people talk about it, it's met with silence or misunderstanding or responses that can be unhelpful. Um, so, I am glad it's getting talked about and spotlighted in the news.
Yeah.
Mhm,
There are some social media influencers, though, that
mhm,
are encouraging young people to do the cutoffs.
yes.
Yeah.
There's somebody called Patrick Tahan. I don't know too much about him, but the New York Times did a feature article, and he's a social worker out of Massachusetts. And he has a toxic parent test, and he will help craft, the cutoff letter, and he has a whole online following, a support group. Um, and again, I think you have to be very careful with these decisions in balancing your own health as well as the benefits, that family does provide, and being realistic that people are flawed, that just like me and you, they have
Mm-hmm.
limitations. And are your
Yeah.
expectations about that person reasonable, and what you want from them? And is that
I find that
negotiable?
cutoffs can be a lot more work than having a trickle of a relationship.
Hmm. Yeah,
What do you
to
think of
hold,
that?
yeah, to
In
make
many
that,
cases, obviously
yeah,
not when you're getting abused.
right. There
Yeah.
are certain cases that are more obvious, but the word abuse, trauma, harm, it's changed over time, generationally
Hmm.
now. People use those words very lightly than 10, 20 years ago. So that if you ask for examples of, well, what did the person do, they give very subtle examples,
Yeah.
that may not really qualify as harm, abuse, trauma.
True. Yes.
Hmm.
So there was you referred to work by Josh Coleman.
Hmm.
Who is Josh Coleman, and what did he share? What did he want to share to therapists about mistakes that they're making with folks that are estranged?
Yeah, because I think many therapists can really collude with their patient, and they don't challenge them to think of alternative hypotheses about why did this blow up or incident happen, and what role did that person play in it? That these things are often multi-determined, and focusing on blaming the other party is not always helpful in the long run. It might feel good in the beginning part, and therapists can really fuel that. But getting back to Josh Coleman, so he wrote a book, "Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict," in 2021, and he's actually a psychologist like us in private practice, but he was struggling with his own relationship with his daughter post divorce. So he surveyed a large number of parents who were estranged from children, and
Hmm.
so, he has specific tips for therapists, because he has observed the negative influence they can have on patients by over focusing on the feeling of anger and blame, so that the perceived trauma becomes the only or the stronger narrative, and it's not well balanced. As we say, living in the grays, versus, a black and white thinking. And it's important to have flexible thinking.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that with high conflict divorce cases.
Hmm.
Individual therapists that might be meeting with the child and just reinforcing sometimes false narratives that come from the one of the parents who feels wronged in the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And it's so important, as a therapist, to teach, perspective taking,
yeah.
and empathy. Can you come up with an alternative reason that they might be doing this or saying this? If the person is really willing to take ownership and make some changes, can you give them, a shot in a safe environment, to do that, in baby steps, and set your boundaries. Tell them what you need and what you will and won't accept.
Are you speaking for the parent or for the adult child?
Well, I guess that would be for everybody. you
Yeah, it
know,
would make sense. Yeah.
yes, yes. And Coleman had a lot of advice, for parents. His basic message was, make amends, and, you must show behavioral change to back it up then. And he often has the parent write a letter of amends, to try to show the child that they understand, their perspective, and to really own up to they've failed their child in some way, and avoid defending, reminding them how you were a good parent,
Hmm.
and really show some empathy.
As I hear that, it sounds a bit biased against the parent. What if the adult child has been the one making mistakes?
Right. And I try to hold their feet to the fire too. I'm thinking of a particular case, the teenage boy was gaming, for hours every day, and the dad was trying to pull him out of that, and they were battling about it. So, I try to say to him, "Do you think you had a role in this, relationship going south? Can you own that little part of it?"
Yeah.
So sure, it goes both ways. I do think more of the repair rests on the adult shoulders. Um, and it's often very slow, and it's when you get this parent, adult child, making it a more egalitarian adult relationship is the goal, and a lot of parents struggle with making that transition, and so do the children, because often they're still, taking money, and they don't have enough skin in the game.
Hmm. You're right. Yeah. Because they're accepting money, so they're showing dependence, but then they also want to be more egalitarian.
Yes, yes,
Hmm.
it's a tough bind, autonomy and closeness.
Yeah. In your presentation, you talked about giving up the fairy tale. What were you referring to?
um, well, I guess it giving up the fairy tale is that, this other person is going to meet all your needs perfectly when you want them. And you have to be a little bit more flexible and work to set your, adjust your expectations, especially as the child becomes an adult and if they repartner,
Okay.
because
Yeah.
now they have a spouse that's calling the shots, so I think it's all about communication,
Yeah.
in advance, and not texting. I think you really need to get on the phone, because with texting, there's too much opportunity for misunderstandings, and people aren't taking the time to really repair and work on these things. So it does take time, focus, and effort.
So you recommend a brave face-to-face meeting, but you recommend also a certain preparation, individual preparation to be able to, right? You want to make it kind, and um, you're going to talk about those difficult things, hopefully with a level and degree of kindness and respect for the,
Exactly.
yeah.
That's huge, and
Hmm.
empathy. um
Yeah. What about, let's say the parent has tried, or the parents have tried,
mhm,
and the adult child just isn't responding and doesn't really seem to want a relationship.
yeah, and
How do you
and
help the
that's
parent deal with that?
Yeah, that's tragic, and it happens quite frequently. There's many
Hmm.
support groups out there that could be helpful, because maybe they don't want to talk about it, with friends. It can be really shame-inducing, um, and getting all sorts of, healthy lifestyle coping in place, whether it's exercise, diet, socialization, getting outside in nature, sunshine, all of those wonderful things, talking to an individual therapist, volunteering, so really making sure they have a balanced life, because many parents are left with a role identity problem. So it's a lot
That's
of work.
right.
Yeah,
Redefining who they are without the child.
exactly.
But I have to
Exactly.
tell you, I have seen people successfully do that in
Hmm.
painful situations where the child did a cutoff.
Hmm.
Um, I have seen joy and a fulfilling life after that.
Hmm. Yeah, I've seen it. I have one of my clients now. His mantra is, I'm beginning to accept that I just can't control this. I'm looking to what I can control, and how can he,
100%.
right, add to his
Yes.
life and other people around him life. The Serenity
Yes.
Prayer addresses that
Yes.
so well.
Yes.
Hmm.
And sometimes parents have to do that. And,
Yeah,
the child does not want a relationship, and they can seek to love those that will love them back. And there's
right.
always an abundance of that.
Hmm.
I have another question. Um, One of my patients actually wanted me to ask you.
Oh.
So, with two of her sisters who have cut each other off and then recently said, okay, we want a relationship,
Hmm.
how do they deal with all of that resentment about the nasty things that were said?
Hmm. Right. And people often ask that question: how much rehashing is good and healthy?
Hmm.
And how much do you sort of, pivot that into what are sort of my requirements, expectations, and boundaries for moving forward? And that's a tough one. I think you have to do a certain amount of addressing the past with a more forward thinking mind. And you have to do it in a way that's not, excuse me, blaming, bashing. You have to do it in a way that's really from a vulnerable place, and leading with your pain about it, and your fears about,
Yeah,
will it happen again? And to get to that point, the person has to do some individual work.
yeah. I agree that it is generally better to lead with sharing your sadness or your anxiety versus your anger.
Right. The anger,
Yeah.
leading with anger will get you nowhere.
I do want to share with the audience, though, that I highly recommend forgiveness therapy
Hmm.
and Robert Enright's work, or anything that you can find at the International Forgiveness Institute. They've got loads of resources on dealing with resentment, which is very painful, recurring, and bad for your physical and mental health.
I was just thinking that so unhealthy to carry that around.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and you know, going back to sort of broadening our lens. Right now we have a lot of disconnection in America. I mean, the recent Stress in America survey in 2025 interviewed a representative national sample and found we have a crisis of connection. And people feel isolated, left out, lacking in companionship to begin with. And that's not even introducing these family, issues.
Yeah.
And you know, results clearly show that those who feel lonely are likely to struggle with physical and mental health problems.
Mm.
So, we already have that going, and then you put the family on there. And, the good news is social connections, both close and casual, can really support psychological and physical well being. And for some
Yeah.
people,
Casual
sport, yeah,
friendships. Yeah. Just like
yeah,
people at the coffee shop
yes.
can support well being. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, so if you have a peppering in your day or a sprinkling in your day of those people, it definitely supports us. And
Hmm.
and we know that high quality relationships predict greater happiness and longevity. And of course, they provide companionship, emotional support, and validation. So if we can get that from our
Totally.
family members, that's great.
Yeah. All right. So, any parting words of wisdom? For example, in the conversation, let's
Mhm.
say they're ready for that difficult conversation. You emphasized forming the ideal or discussing what is the ideal. Can you give examples?
The ideal relationship? Well,
Yeah. Sort of
yeah.
like, what is it that you want versus I don't like this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would be, how frequently, you see the person. So all the logistics,
Huh.
as well as what kind of behavior, you like, and also what are your pet peeves? I find it challenging, when you do this. And, my goal is to, have, more harmony or whatever it might be. I have two sisters, they have rules. They do not talk about religion or politics, and they remind each other, oh, we're going there. We agreed we were not going to do that, because every time they do that, they ended up in a screaming match and hanging up the phone, and then weeks and months go by and they both were getting, physically sick over it.
Mm.
So, and this is a lot of families. I mean, during COVID, it was, the risk tolerance, you know,
Hmm.
now it's a lot of political divide, right?
Yeah.
On top of all the other stuff we navigate with our families
The
all the
political
time.
divide,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Now, you're in Morristown and you have a private practice. Um,
Yes.
do you see people from other states or just local? There's
Yeah, I'm SIPAC certified. So I do see people from other states as long as they are SIPACs. It's a SIPAC state. Thank you so much for having me.
great to have you.